Propositional logic. Now we're going to be going to section 6.1, and I'm going to teach you in this first set of videos how to translate ordinary propositions using symbolic language. Okay, so you already know that when you have English sentences, often the skeleton or argument form, it can be obscured, right? So we've already been using letters to represent classes, like all apples are fruits that are juicy. We've used we've used like A for apples, the class of apples, and the class of juicy fruits, we'd say J, right? So you already know the benefit of using like a letter to represent classes. With propositional logic, we're also going to use letters, but they're going to be representing whole propositions. So really our fundamental terms now are going to go to propositions, and we'll use letters to represent those propositions. But also we're going to connect propositions to other propositions and introduce something new besides letters, which will be connectives or operators. Okay? So we're going to use special symbols called operators or connectives that will aid us in recognizing forms of arguments. Okay? Propositions will be represented by letters, and these letters will be combined by means of the operators or connectives. Okay? So we're going to jump up the symbolizing, the symbolic language to a new level here, because we're going to be using operators along with letters. Okay? So what we first have to do before we get going, you have to understand the difference between a simple component or a simple sentence or proposition, and then compound propositions. Compound propositions is when you're using connectives to connect two simple propositions or two simple components. And this will make a lot of sense as I start showing you how we translate sentences using symbolic language. This will all make sense. But let's first talk about simple statements, because these are the things that are going to be combined by way of connectives to start using this step up in symbolic language. Okay, you're going to see this is a little bit more powerful, and it really takes a lot of wordiness and gets it down to the skeleton. And as I previously said, that's not new to you. You see, when you get something down to a skeleton using letters, boy, it really helps. Well, here, propositional logic, in our main terms and units or propositions, it does the same thing. Okay? So here's some examples of simple statements. Fast foods tend to be unhealthy. And of course we're going to use the word F. F will represent this entire proposition. J for James Joyce wrote Ulysses. P for parakeets or colorful birds. Simple statements. Propositional logic uses simple statements, combines them with connectives, and then you have compound statements. Compound statements are statements that contain at least one simple statement, and it's using a connective, often to other simple statements. Okay? So let me give you some examples here of compound propositions, or statements here. It is not the case that Al-Qaeda is a humanitarian organization. Okay? Diana Reeves sings jazz, and there's a connective. Christina, that should be Christina, so I misspelled that there. Christina Aguilera sings pop. Okay, let's erase that a little bit here. See if I can do that a little better. Okay, so Diana Reeves sings jazz and Christina Aguilera sings pop. See the and? It's combining Diana Reeves sings jazz and Christina Aguilera sings pop. Now you may be wondering, this one, Al-Qaeda is a humanitarian organization, not. They still consider this a compound proposition, even though they're not connecting one proposition to another one. The fact that this is using a connective, that's why this first example, they call it a compound proposition. But most of them, you're going to be using a connective, combining one simple component with another one. And some compound propositions there's more than two simple components and more than one connective used, okay? So this is a little different, but the book calls it a compound proposition. Maybe a little anomaly, don't worry about it. It's a compound proposition, and we'll just move on. Let me give you another one. Either people get serious about conservation or energy prices will skyrocket. If the world's nations spurn international law, then future wars are guaranteed. Here's another one. The Broncos will win if and only if they run the ball, okay? So you know what simple statements are, you know what compound statements are. Let's talk a little bit more about these connectives, because compound propositions can be symbolized because we put letters on the simple propositions, then use a connective to relate it to another simple proposition that's also represented by a letter. And I'll go right to the symbolic language in a minute here. Here are the connectives, okay? It is not the case that, or it could be not, or it is false that. If you have a simple statement that's using this kind of connective, it's called a negation, and you use this little symbol. This is a tilde, that's pronounced tilde. And when I hand you out the assessments, when you download the test questions and stuff like that, and you go to the quizzes tab, tilde, there is a key for tilde, so you'll be able to see this in my typing, okay? And if you have the connective and being used, and this can also, the word but also is considered a conjunction. So and or but is a conjunction, and that's going to be represented by a dot. And what I will do on the keyboard, I'm just going to be using the period sign. So in the book you could have Tiffany sells jewelry and Gucci sells perfume, something like that. I don't know if that's right. In the book the dot is kind of in the middle, but I'm going to be using the keyboard. So instead, you're going to see me use a period sign, okay? And so it's going to be something like that, but if you see T period G, I mean a conjunction, okay? So if it's but or and, it's a conjunction. The symbol is a period sign, or it's called a dot. If you have an either or, this is called a disjunction, and we will use a wedge. And on my keyboard, I'm just going to use a lowercase v, okay, on the keyboard. So you're just going to see a small v. That works pretty well. That's called a wedge. So a tilde is this little squiggly symbol. A dot is going to be the period sign, and it's just a dot. In the textbook, it's in the middle. It'll work with the keyboard if we use a period sign, and a wedge is a small v. Okay, let's go to the next. There's two others because there's 5 of these. Here we go. If you have an if-then, this is called a conditional, and in the book it uses a horseshoe operator that looks like that, but for the keyboard we're going to use the greater than sign. So if you see the greater than sign, I mean a horseshoe, and it's just because of the limits of our keyboard. So when I'm typing out test questions, or you go to the quizzes tab and you see a greater than sign, I mean we're dealing with a horseshoe, and the greater than sign is the closest thing I could come up with for the horseshoe operator. But this sideways U is called the horseshoe. And then if and only if, in the book it is a triple bar, okay, triple bar. But I'm going to use an equal sign, okay? So if you see the equal sign, I mean the triple bar, okay? So with that, why don't we translate some sentences, and I think this will start making more sense, and then I'll have some examples. I'm going to give you several examples in part 2 of this video of how to translate sentences, okay? With some rules. I do have some rules here that are coming up. Okay. Negation. If you see a negation, it would be like does not. It is not the case. It is false. So If we have it is not the case that Rolex makes computers, or Rolex does not make computers, or it is false that Rolex makes computers, just to stay close to the language, have your R. The R is going to be Rolex makes computers, okay? Rolex makes computers, okay? That's what I would... So, Rolex makes computers is R. It is not the case that Rolex makes computers is tilde R. But you would say this, you wouldn't say tilde R, you would say it's not the case that R, okay? Rolex does not make computers. Keep making R, Rolex makes computers, and then when you have the does not, you put the tilde there, it's not the case R. Tilde R. It is false that Rolex makes computers, same thing. Okay? So let's go down to conjunctions. You remember conjunctions means and, also, but, however, yet, still, moreover, although, nevertheless. Most of your common conjunctions are either going to be and or but, and most of them are going to be the and, okay? But if you see some of these other words here, and you go, huh, what is that? It is the dot operator. It's a conjunction. So if you have Tiffany sells jewelry and Gucci sells cologne, well, I would use a T for Tiffany sells jewelry, so would you. G for Gucci sells cologne, and because there's an and here, this is a conjunction, you would just diagram, you would symbolize it with T dot G, but what you would say is, in English, this means both T and G. That's how you would say that. Okay, if we have a disjunction, the common ones are or unless. So if you see an or like we do here, then the symbolic language for either Tiffany sells jewelry or Gucci sells cologne is T wedge G, and the way you would pronounce this is either T or G. Okay, a conditional. If you have a conditional, you're dealing with an if-then. And so if you know it's a conditional, you know you're going to be dealing with a horseshoe. And remember, my keyboard, I'm going to use the greater than symbol. So if you see an if in a sentence, you're dealing with the horseshoe operator. But here's something you need to know. Sometimes you won't see the word if. You may see in case, given that, provided that, on condition that. If you see these words, they are synonyms for if. So if you didn't see an if, but you saw the word, the phrase, given that, I just want you to automatically go, that is a synonym for if, and I'm dealing with a horseshoe operator, so I'm going to write down the horseshoe, and I know that's what I'm going to have to use symbolic language with that operator. Okay? So if you see an if, you know you're dealing with a conditional. Also, if you see the phrase only if, you're dealing with a conditional. But you've got to make sure you understand, if and only if are not the same. This is different than only if. If you see only if, don't make this mistake. Oh, I see an if. And then you start translating it as if it was just an if. It's not. Only if means something different than if, and so it's translated differently, okay? So that's the first point. If is different than only if. But if you have an if, you translate a sentence differently than if you have a sentence that has only if, okay? So let's talk about that. This is one of these rules you'll have to know. If you have a proposition or a compound proposition, and you see the word if, what always follows if is the antecedent. I should probably talk about this. This is in your book. If you have if P, then Q, okay? This is a conditional. The P is called the antecedent, okay? Antecedent. Okay? This ante means before, right? So the antecedent is the proposition that comes before the horseshoe operator. Q is, you know, and these are like the X in algebra. P can stand for any proposition, even a compound proposition. Q can stand for any proposition, even a compound proposition. But the proposition that is before the horseshoe operator is called the antecedent, and the proposition that comes after the horseshoe operator is called the consequent. Okay? Alright, so just remember that consequent is if you do this, these are the consequences, right? Consequences always come after you've done something when you've been a little kid, and even as an adult. Antecedent, this is the proposition before. Okay, so now that you know what antecedent and consequent means, you'll understand some of these rules about translating, okay? If you have a sentence and you see if, the proposition that follows if is always the antecedent. So you see this here, see if H. Here's if, and I just told you the rule is the antecedent always follows if. Now because you see that if there, you know you're dealing with a conditional. So go ahead and just write down a horseshoe. You see if, you're dealing with an if-then conditional type of statement. So we know we have a horseshoe. But I've just told you the antecedent follows if. So that means H goes here. H is the antecedent and C is the consequent. So this is actually how you would translate that. H, if H, then C. That's how you'd say this. You don't want to say H horseshoe C. The way to say this in English is if H, then C. Okay? Now, so that's for if. The antecedent always, that proposition follows if. But if you have the phrase only if, the consequent proposition, and it could be a compound proposition, follows only if. Remember, only if is different than if. Okay? So, if you have C, only if H, there's that only if. This is different than if. I just told you the consequent follows only if. So here, because it has only if, you know it's a conditional, so go ahead and write down your horseshoe. If you see if you see only if, you're dealing with a conditional. So I just told you that the consequent follows only if, so this is going to go in the same order. It will be C only if H. You see how this is different than this one. C if H is if H, then C. C only if H is if C, then H. And let me give you an example here. What I want you all to do is trust the rules. Trust these logicians. They know what they're talking about. Only if means something different than if. Okay, now here's an example. You will catch a fish only if your hook was baited. Okay, let's do C for catch a fish. And only if your hook was baited, we'll call that B. Okay? Now let's say you didn't trust the logicians and you're not believing me, and you see this if and you go, oh, there's if. So this, I'm going to translate it B horseshoe C, and the way you would say that in English is if B, then C. But in English, you know what this means? This means if your hook was baited, then you will catch a fish, right? Now, is that true? If your hook was baited, then you'll catch a fish? I wish. I've been fishing a lot, and my hook has been baited, and that's no guarantee that you're going to catch a fish, okay? So if you don't believe the rule and go, oh, only if, and you translate it that the antecedent follows only if, you're going to get this. If your hook was baited, then you'll catch a fish. Or if your hook is baited, maybe that's better to say that, then you will catch a fish. That's not true, okay? But if you translate it the way you're supposed to, it says if you're, well, let's go back here. Let's come down and we'll just keep with this sentence. But if you follow the rule, okay? You will catch a fish only if your hook was baited. Okay, this would be C, horseshoe, and remember the consequent follows your hook was baited. Then you see what this is? This makes sense. This is saying if you caught a fish, if you catch a fish, then your hook was baited. Okay? If you catch a fish or caught a fish, then your hook was baited. You see how this makes sense. If you caught a fish, then your hook was baited. So only if, trust this rule, you will catch a fish only if your hook was baited means if you caught a fish, then your hook was baited. It doesn't mean if you bait your hook, then you'll catch a fish. Okay? All right. And this just reiterates there. Okay? Now, let's go to biconditional. If and only if means is a sufficient and necessary condition for. So, JFK tightens security if and only if O'Hare does. This just, you can translate this with symbolic language just how it reads. If JFK tightens security if and only if O'Hare does. Okay? Okay. And I don't know why I have a K there. This should be an O. Okay? I don't know what happened there. So if JFK tightens security, if and only if O'Hare does, you will symbolize that in the exact order that it appears. Okay? And remember, I'm using the equal sign with my typewriter, but I mean the triple bar. Okay, now, there's something very important here. Before you can begin to translate sentences, you have to know what the main operator is. You remember when we looked at these things, I said, this is a conjunction, use the dot. It's a disjunction, use the wedge, the small v. It's a biconditional, so we're dealing with a triple bar. You need to find out what the main operator is, because then what you can do, if you know it's a conjunction, go ahead and write down the dot. If you know it's a disjunction, put down your v. If you know the main operator is a conditional, go ahead and put down your horseshoe and then determine what's going on either side of the horseshoe operator. What's the antecedent or conditional going to be? What's the disjunct going to be, which is on the left or right of the wedge? And what are the conjuncts, the left or right of the dot? And the main operator, let me define that, but I want to tell you it's important. You have to know ultimately what kind of a compound proposition am I dealing with here. So the main operator in a compound statement is that operator that governs the largest amount of components in the statement. Identifying the main operator is very important in identifying what a compound statement ultimately is. Is it a conditional? Is it a conjunction or a disjunction? And in your current edition, you're going to be examining the tan boxes. But if you go to section 6.1, please study the tan boxes. They're going to have like 3 examples of a disjunction, of a negation, of a conjunction, of a biconditional, of a conditional. You need to realize all of those different statements, they all are disjunctions in the one box for disjunction examples. Or these are all our conjunctions, all our conditionals. Understand that, because you have to know the main operator, because this helps you translate whatever you're looking at into the proper symbols using this symbolic language. Okay? We're going to stop here and then we're going to go to part 2. I'll give you some rules to keep in mind. Some I've already given you. I'll add a few more, and then we're going to start translating some sentences.